My husband mocked my cute little bakery in front of his business partners. 3 months later, he was handing me his resume. Turns out my small business wasn't so small after all. The upscale restaurant buzzed with the typical Friday night energy, but our private dining section felt like a pressure cooker. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Maison's exclusive upper floor, the city skyline sparkled like scattered diamonds against the darkening sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat quietly, watching my husband Marcus charm his way through another business dinner, his confidence fueled by expensive wine and the presence of his corporate colleagues. The same colleagues who had no idea that the quaint little bakery he loved to joke about was now a multi-million-dollar operation with contracts across the city. The private dining room's warm lighting caught the subtle gold threads in the wallpaper, creating an almost ethereal glow around the table of power players. The air was thick with the scent of truffle risotto and ambition, punctuated by the gentle clink of crystal glasses and forced laughter. "Gentlemen," Marcus raised his glass, his designer watch catching the light. "Let me tell you about my wife's adorable hobby." He turned to me with that familiar condescending smile, the one that had evolved from mildly irritating to ammunition over our 7 years of marriage. "Amy here thinks she's building an empire with her cupcakes." The forced laughter around the table made my skin crawl, but I maintained my practiced smile. 7 years of marriage had taught me how to play this role perfectly. If Marcus had bothered to check our local business registry, he'd know that my cute bakery had expanded to 15 locations across 3 states. If he'd paid attention to his company's vendor list, he'd realize that my wholesale division, operating under a different brand, supplied all their corporate events. But Marcus never looked beyond the surface of anything that wasn't directly about him. "Tell them about your little delivery van, honey," Marcus continued, winking at David Palmer, his company's CEO. "She thinks she's going to compete with actual food service companies." He emphasized actual with the same tone someone might use to explain reality to a child. I caught Rebecca Torres's eye across the table, noting how she subtly adjusted her designer glasses, our private signal that everything was proceeding as planned. As the head of corporate purchasing for Marcus's firm, she'd signed the contract with my wholesale division just yesterday, a 7-figure deal that would make my company their exclusive supplier. Not that Marcus had ever bothered to look at who signed his company's catering contracts. "It's just something to keep her busy," Marcus explained, signaling for another bottle of wine, his third of the evening. "You know how it is. Some wives need their little projects to feel important." He reached over to pat my hand in what others might mistake for an affectionate gesture, but I felt the subtle pressure behind it, a reminder to play my part. Around us, the city's business elite shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I noticed at least 3 people checking their phones under the table, no doubt connecting the dots between my hobby and the major supplier they'd just partnered with. The tension in the room was palpable, though Marcus, in his wine-induced confidence, remained oblivious to it. I smoothed my napkin, a gesture that had become my center of calm during these displays, remembering the meeting I'd had with my expansion team that morning. Our projections showed we'd hit 9 figures by year's end. The wholesale division alone had grown 300% since Marcus had last bothered to check in on my little project. The acquisition plans sitting in my office safe would push those numbers even higher. "She even has business cards," Marcus chuckled, pulling one from my purse without asking, a habit he'd developed that perfectly exemplified his attitude toward boundaries. "Chief Executive Baker, isn't that precious?" He flashed the card around the table like a magician revealing a particularly amusing trick. What Marcus failed to notice was the small Holdings Group text beneath my bakery's logo, or the fact that my business card was printed on the same premium stock used by Fortune 500 companies. He'd never noticed much about my business, beyond the single storefront I'd started with, the one he called my expensive hobby when I opened it 7 years ago. The secret to a happy marriage: Marcus continued, his words slightly slurred as he leaned in conspiratorially toward David Palmer, is letting your wife think she's a businesswoman while you handle the real work. Right, honey? He turned to Atsi, me with that familiar patronizing smile that had cost him more than he could imagine. I took a deliberate sip of water, catching Rebecca's subtle headshake. The timing of tomorrow's announcement couldn't have been better. In less than 12 hours, Marcus would discover exactly what kind of businesswoman he'd been mocking all these years. My phone buzzed silently in my lap. Another update from my legal team confirming everything was in place. The corporate acquisition papers were ready, the press release drafted, and the new management structure approved by the board. Sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones you have to wait for, and this one was nearly ready to serve. As I watched Marcus pour himself another glass of wine, I couldn't help but think how fitting it was that a man who built his career in corporate consulting had failed to consult the most important business document of all, his own company's vendor list. Tomorrow would change everything, but for tonight, I would play my part one last time, the supportive wife with her cute little bakery that could. I saw a glimmer of recognition in David Palmer's eyes as he studied my business card more carefully than Marcus ever had. The holographic watermark caught the light, revealing the full scope of Sweet Success Holdings' corporate structure. My husband was too busy ordering another bottle of wine to notice the CEO's sudden interest. You know what's funny? Marcus continued, loosening his tie as the evening wore on. Last week, Amy tried to give me advice about our company's catering budget. Can you believe it? He laughed, but the sound died quickly when he realized he was the only one amused. Honey, tell them what you said about our quarterly spending. I set down my water glass carefully, years of practice keeping my voice steady. I simply suggested that consolidating vendors might reduce costs. See what I mean? Marcus interrupted, speaking over me as he often did. She thinks running a corporate consulting firm is like managing a cookie shop. Darling, leave the big business decisions to those of us who understand the corporate world. Rebecca Torres cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses again. Actually, Marcus, I've been meaning to discuss our new vendor contract. Not now. Rebecca. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. I'm teaching an important lesson about knowing your lane. Amy here needs to understand that there's a difference between selling cupcakes and running a real business. David Palmer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between me and the business card he still held. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head as he connected the dots. The elegant typography, the corporate structure listed. In small print, the professional credentials that Marcus had never bothered to read. Marcus, David began carefully. Perhaps we should... Let me tell you about the time she wanted to attend a business strategy meeting. Marcus plowed ahead, oblivious to the growing tension around the table. I had to explain that ordering flour in bulk doesn't quite qualify as supply chain management. I checked my phone discreetly as another message came through. My expansion team had finalized the last details for tomorrow's announcement. The press release was ready, the legal documents prepared, and our new corporate headquarters signage was being installed overnight. 7 years of careful planning were about to bear fruit. The thing about small businesses, Marcus continued, gesturing with his wine glass, is that they're just that, small. No complexity, no real strategy. Just simple transactions, right, honey? Around the table, I noticed several executives exchanging knowing looks. They'd all seen the news about Sweet Success Holdings' recent acquisitions, even if they hadn't yet, connected it to my cute little bakery. Tomorrow's revelation would change that. Did you know, I spoke up, my voice carrying that quiet authority I usually reserved for board meetings, that the food service industry generated $997 billion in revenue last year? Marcus laughed patronizingly. See what I mean? She reads these little business articles and thinks, and did you know, I continued smoothly, that corporate catering alone represents a $64.8 billion market? For the first time that evening, Marcus looked slightly uncertain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Perhaps it was my tone, or maybe he finally noticed how intently David Palmer was studying my business card. "Now, honey," Marcus said, his condescending smile faltering slightly. "Nobody's saying your bakery isn't successful in its own small way, but let's not pretend." "Sweet Success Holdings," David Palmer interrupted, reading from my card. "Isn't that the company that just acquired Regional Foods Network?" The color drained from Marcus's face as he processed this information. Regional Foods Network was his firm's largest competitor in the corporate catering consultation space. They'd been trying to arrange a meeting with the new ownership for weeks. "That's impossible," Marcus scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Regional Foods is a $100 million company. Amy runs a bakery." "A bakery," I agreed, allowing myself a small smile. "That happens to be the parent company of the largest corporate catering network in 3 states. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus reached for my business card, really looking at it for the first time in 7 years. I watched as his eyes widened, taking in the corporate structure, the subsidiaries, the holding company details he'd dismissed as irrelevant for so long. But you bake cupcakes," he stammered, his wine glass forgotten. "I built an empire," I corrected him gently, "starting with cupcakes. While you were busy mocking my cute little bakery, I was acquiring companies, streamlining operations, and building the largest independent food service corporation in the region." Rebecca Torres chose that moment to slide a folder across the table. "Speaking of which, Marcus, here's the new vendor contract I mentioned. You might want to look at who owns your company's exclusive catering provider now." Tomorrow's announcement would make it official, but watching the realization dawn on my husband's face as he finally understood the true scope of my little project was worth every condescending comment I'd endured. Sometimes the best revenge isn't serving revenge at all. It's serving success with a side of sweet irony. Marcus stared at the contract in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. Each turn revealed another subsidiary of Sweet Success Holdings, another company I'd built or acquired while he was busy dismissing my business acumen. The wine-induced flush had drained from his face, replaced by a pallor I'd never seen before. "This is..." He swallowed hard, looking up at me with new eyes. "This is a billion-dollar corporation." $1.2 billion, actually, I corrected him gently, after the Regional Foods acquisition. I turned to David Palmer, who was watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed fascination. "I apologize for not being more transparent earlier, David, but I wanted to ensure the merger was finalized before making any announcements." The corporate dining room had grown so quiet you could hear the ice settling in water glasses. Every executive at the table was now openly staring at their phones, no doubt Googling Sweet Success Holdings and discovering just how far my cute little bakery had come. "But you've been working out of that small storefront," Marcus protested, weakly. "I've seen it. It's just a neighborhood bakery." Rebecca Torres cleared her throat. "That location is actually listed in industry publications as one of the most successful examples of a CEO maintaining direct market connection. Staying close to your roots while building an empire. It's been written up in Harvard Business Review." Marcus's head snapped up. "Harvard Business? Amy, you said that subscription was for baking magazines." "I never said that," I corrected him. "You assumed it was for baking magazines, just like you assumed I was just running a bakery. You never asked about the other 14 locations, the distribution centers, or why I needed a corporate legal team." "A corporate legal..." Marcus loosened his tie further, looking like he might need air. "The law firm you said was helping with recipes?" "Mergers and acquisitions, actually. Though we do have an excellent intellectual property division for protecting our recipes." I smiled at David Palmer. Which reminds me, David, we should discuss your company's position after tomorrow's announcement. Marcus's head whipped between David and me. What announcement? Sweet Success Holdings is announcing its acquisition of Regional Foods Network tomorrow morning, David explained, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of appreciation. And apparently they already own Supreme Catering Solutions, our exclusive vendor. Which means, Rebecca added, sliding another document across the table, your consulting firm now operates under my wife's corporate umbrella. My eyes met Rebecca's, sharing a moment of satisfaction. Our marriage had been a carefully guarded secret in business circles, much like my corporate empire. Marcus's jaw dropped as he looked between Rebecca and me. You two are married? Yes, Rebecca confirmed. Not all wives are interested in being just wives, Marcus. The implications were finally sinking in. His company's largest competitor and exclusive vendor were now both owned by his wife's corporation. The cute little bakery he'd mocked for 7 years had quietly grown into a corporate giant that could determine his professional fate. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. I tried, Marcus. Every time I brought up business expansion, you told me to focus on frosting techniques. When I mentioned market analysis, you patted my head and said to leave the big business to you. When I suggested corporate restructuring, you laughed and asked if I was rearranging the display case. David Palmer stood, straightening his jacket. I believe tomorrow's announcement will make things clear. Amy, or should I say Ms. Sullivan, we should discuss the future of our corporate partnership soon. My office? I suggested. The real one, not the bakery. Marcus's head snapped up. Real office? Sweet Success Tower, Rebecca supplied. The 40-story building downtown with the rooftop garden. Though the bakery does make an excellent cover for high-level meetings, nobody suspects major corporate deals are being made over cupcakes. I stood, smoothing my dress. Marcus, dear, I believe you have some thinking to do. About business, about assumptions, and about what it means to be just anything. I turned to the group. If you'll excuse me, I have a press conference to prepare for. As I walked away from the table, I heard Marcus ask in a dazed voice, She has a press conference? Of course, David replied. Regional Foods Network's acquisition is big news, though probably not as big as the news that the city's fastest-growing corporation is run by someone you dismissed as a simple baker. The sweet taste of success, I've found, is best served with a side of humble pie. The next morning, I sat in my corner office on the 38th floor of Sweet Success Tower, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and promise. The press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m., but the business world was already buzzing with speculation about the Regional Foods acquisition. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since I'd arrived at 6 a.m. Marcus had called 17 times, each call going straight to voicemail. He'd also sent 32 texts, ranging from apologetic to desperate as the reality of his situation sank in. The media teams are ready, my executive assistant Jennifer announced, entering with her trademark. Efficiency. CNBC, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal are all set up in the conference room. They're particularly interested in the local bakery to billion-dollar empire angle. I smiled, remembering Marcus's words from just last week. Honey, maybe you should stick to what you know. Nobody cares about a little bakery story. Ms. Sullivan, Jennifer continued, a slight smirk playing at her lips. Your husband is in the lobby, again. Security says he's been there since 7 a.m., showing everyone his driver's license to prove he's married to you. How the tables turn, I mused, adjusting my blazer. What's he saying? Mostly that there must be some mistake. That his wife runs a bakery, not a corporation. Though he did get quite excited when he saw your name on the building. The Sweet Success Tower lobby featured a wall of achievements, chronicling our growth from a single bakery to a corporate empire. Marcus would be seeing for the first time The business awards, the magazine covers, and the acquisition announcements. He'd dismissed as cute little write-ups about your cookies over the years. The board of directors has arrived for the pre-announcement meeting, Jennifer added, including Mrs. Torres Martinez. Rebecca had been my rock through all of this, both as my wife and as a key player in our corporate strategy. We'd met at a business conference 5 years ago, the same conference Marcus had laughed at me for attending, saying I was playing at being a businesswoman. Send Marcus up, I decided. It's time he saw what his little baker has been building. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out looking like he hadn't slept. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The confident swagger from last night was gone, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief as he took in my executive floor. Amy, he breathed, staring at the wall of business magazine covers featuring my face. What? How? Welcome to my office, Marcus. The real one. I gestured to the sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows. A bit different from the bakery's back room, isn't it? He wandered in like a man in a dream, taking in the executive suite that was larger than our first apartment. His eyes landed on the scale model of our new corporate campus, currently under construction. All this time, he whispered, when you were working late at the bakery. Board meetings, I supplied. Merger negotiations, strategy sessions. The bakery's kitchen makes an excellent cover for high-level corporate discussions. Nobody suspects major deals are being made over coffee and croissants. But why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked slightly. I'm your husband. I tried, Marcus. For 7 years I tried. But you were so convinced you knew exactly what I was capable of, or rather, what I wasn't capable of, that you never actually listened. Rebecca chose that moment to enter, her presence commanding. As always. The board is ready, Amy, and the press is getting eager. Marcus's eyes widened further as he looked between us. You two know each other? Oh, honey. I couldn't help but smile. Rebecca isn't just my board member, she's my wife. The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications hit him. All those dinner parties where he'd dismissed both. Our business acumen. All those times he'd mocked our little jobs while bragging about his corporate conquests. You're married? He stammered. But what about? Our marriage ended 2 years ago, Marcus, I said gently. The papers you signed without reading? They weren't for a new bakery location. His legs seemed to give out as he sank into one of my visitor chairs. I don't understand. None of this makes sense. You bake cupcakes. I built an empire, I corrected. Him. One that now owns your company, by the way. Which brings us to why you're here. Marcus stared at the manila envelope I placed on my desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. What's this? Your company's new management structure, I replied, watching him pull out the documents. As of this morning's announcement, your consulting firm operates under the Sweet Success Holdings umbrella, which means some changes are in order. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the city sprawling below us. 7 years of watching Marcus underestimate me had led to this moment. The press conference would begin in 20 minutes, but first he needed to understand exactly what his years of condescension had cost him. You're demoting me? His voice cracked as he scanned the papers. Actually, I'm offering you a chance to keep your job, I corrected him, though not as CEO. That position will be filled by someone who actually reads contracts before signing them. Rebecca stepped forward, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. We've reviewed your company's performance over the past 5 years, Marcus. The numbers are less than impressive. The irony, I added, unable to resist, is that if you'd listened to my suggestions about vendor consolidation and supply chain management, you know, the ones you laughed off as cute little bakery talk, your company might not have been so vulnerable to acquisition. Marcus loosened his tie, looking lost in my expansive office. But you're a baker. I'm a CEO who happens to love baking, I corrected him. Just like I'm a corporate strategist who enjoys creating new recipes. One doesn't negate the other, Marcus. Your inability to see that has been your biggest failure. Jennifer appeared. At the door. Ms. Sullivan, the press is ready, and the Regional Foods Board members have arrived for the signing ceremony. Marcus's head snapped up. Regional Foods? The company that's been trying to buy us out? The company I just acquired, I clarified. Along with your firm and 3 other major players in the corporate consulting space. As of this morning, Sweet Success Holdings is the largest independent business services provider in the region. All those times you were at the bakery, Marcus whispered. I was building this, I gestured to the empire around us. Every time you mocked my little business meetings at the bakery, I was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. While you were laughing about my cookie sales, I was orchestrating corporate takeovers. The bakery wasn't just a business, Marcus. It was the perfect cover for building something bigger. Rebecca checked her watch. Amy, we should head to the press conference. The market's open in 30 minutes. I turned back to Marcus, who was still staring at the organizational chart showing his new position, several levels below his former role. You have a choice to make, I told him. You can either accept the position offered under new management, or you can resign. Either way, the company you've been running is now mine. You planned this, he said slowly, realization dawning. All those years of letting me think you were just a baker? I smiled. No, Marcus. You chose to think that. I just chose not to correct you. Sometimes the best strategy is letting people underestimate you. The door opened again, and David Palmer entered with several board members. Amy, the media's asking about the integration. Timeline for the acquired companies. Tell them we'll address that during the Q&A, I replied, gathering my notes for the press conference. Oh, and David, please show Marcus to HR if he decides to accept the new position. He'll need to fill out quite a bit of paperwork. As I headed toward the door, Marcus called out, Amy, wait. All those business dinners where I talked down to you were being watched by the very executives you were trying to impress. I finished for him. Funny how things work out, isn't it? The wife you thought needed business explained to her now owns your company. I paused at the door, turning back one last time. You know what the secret to success is, Marcus? It's not about who speaks the loudest or brags the most. It's about building something solid, brick by brick. Or in my case, cupcake by cupcake, while everyone else underestimates you. The morning sun caught the gold lettering on my office door as I walked out. Amy Sullivan, CEO, Sweet Success Holdings. Below it, in smaller text, was the line that had been there since day one, the one Marcus had always found so amusing. Every empire starts with a single cupcake. As I stepped onto the stage for the press conference, cameras flashing and reporters calling my name, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the biggest success stories start with the smallest beginnings, and the sweetest revenge is serving it with a side of humble pie. 3 months later, I sat in the same office, reviewing our quarterly reports. Marcus had accepted the position, several rungs down the corporate ladder, and was finally learning what it meant to work for someone who understood both business and baking. The press had dubbed our acquisition the Cupcake Conquest, and business schools were already writing case studies about the bakery that became a billion-dollar empire. Just a baker? Rebecca smiled, bringing me my afternoon coffee. I think not. I picked up the day's paper, featuring our latest headline. Sweet Success Holdings announces global expansion. Below it was a photo of me in my original bakery, the place where it all began, and where Marcus had made the mistake of underestimating exactly what a little bakery could become. The Forbes interviewer adjusted her recorder as I showed her around my original bakery location. 6 months had passed since the acquisition announcement, and the media's fascination with the cupcake queen of corporate America hadn't waned. "So this is where it all started?" she asked, taking in the cozy space with its display cases full of artisanal pastries. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and possibility. "Right here," I confirmed, running my hand along the well-worn counter. Though Marcus used to call it my expensive hobby. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The same counter where he'd once mocked my business aspirations now hosted meetings with international investors. The bell above the door chimed, and speak of the devil, Marcus walked in. He'd traded his designer suits for the company's standard business casual attire, appropriate for his new middle management position. The past 6 months in his reduced role had changed him, humbled him in ways I never expected. Quarterly. "Reports are ready for review," he said, holding up a folder. Then, noticing the interviewer, he started to retreat. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "Actually," I said, "why don't you stay? Sarah here is doing a piece on business transformation. Your perspective could be valuable." The interviewer's eyes lit up at this unexpected opportunity. Marcus hesitated, then took a seat at one of the small tables where he'd spent countless hours patronizingly explaining real business to me. "Marcus," Sarah began, "how does it feel working for your ex-wife's corporation after spending years underestimating her?" he finished, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "It's been educational." "Did you know Amy completed her MBA while running this bakery?" "I didn't. I was too busy telling everyone she was playing entrepreneur to notice she was actually becoming one. I busied myself with arranging a fresh display of macarons, letting Marcus continue. This was the first time he'd spoken publicly about our role reversal. "The day of the announcement," he continued, "I found out that half the business meetings I'd been chasing for years had already happened, right here in this bakery. While I was networking at expensive restaurants, Amy was closing million-dollar deals over coffee and croissants." "The bakery was the perfect cover," I added, rejoining the conversation. "Nobody suspects major corporate negotiations are happening at a corner cafe." Every time Marcus bragged about his power lunches, I was hosting board meetings in our private tasting room. Sarah turned to Marcus. "And now you report to the woman you once dismissed as just a baker?" Marcus adjusted his company ID badge, the same one he'd initially refused to wear, claiming there must be some mistake. "I report to the CEO who built a billion-dollar empire while I was too arrogant to see what was happening right in front of me." "It's actually quite poetic," Rebecca's voice came from the doorway. She'd arrived for our daily strategy meeting, impeccable as always in her designer suit. The man who thought he had to explain business to his wife now learns business principles from her company's training program. Marcus flushed slightly but held his ground. These months working under the corporate structure he'd once mocked had taught him humility, and perhaps something more valuable. "You know what the biggest irony is?" he said, addressing the interviewer but looking at me. "All those times I laughed at Amy's little business meetings at the bakery. She was building something I could only dream of. While I was shouting my success from rooftops, she was quietly creating an empire." I watched him gather his papers, preparing to return to his cubicle, such a change from his former corner office. "The quarterly reports look good," he added professionally. "The integration of regional foods is proceeding ahead of schedule." As he left, Sarah turned to me. "That must be satisfying having him work for you now." I considered her question as I pulled a fresh batch of my signature lavender macarons from the kitchen. "The satisfaction isn't in having him work for me," I replied. "It's in finally being seen for who I've always been. Not just a baker, not just a wife, but a businesswoman who understood that the sweetest success comes to those who let others underestimate them." Rebecca smiled, helping herself to a macaron. Though the look on his face when he realized his little baker wife owned his company was pretty satisfying too. The interview continued as the afternoon sun streamed through the bakery's windows. illuminating the space where I'd built my empire one cupcake at a time. On the wall, framed next to our first dollar, hung the business card Marcus had once mocked. Chief Executive Baker, now a badge of pride rather than a source of condescension. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about rising above, building something extraordinary, and letting success speak for itself. Though watching your doubters eat humble pie certainly adds a sweet finishing touch. 1 year after the acquisition that shook the business world, I stood at the podium in Harvard Business School's largest auditorium. The room was packed with MBA students and faculty, all eager to hear about the cupcake strategy that had become a case study in corporate stealth expansion. The key to building an empire, I began, catching sight of Marcus in the back row. He'd asked to attend today's lecture. Isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about letting others underestimate you while you quietly build something extraordinary. The projection behind me showed the growth chart of Sweet Success Holdings, from single bakery to billion-dollar corporation. Each milestone was marked with a small cupcake icon, drawing chuckles from the audience. 7 years ago, my then-husband told me that running a bakery wasn't real business, I continued, watching Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat. He said I needed to leave corporate strategy to those who understood it. What he didn't realize was that every weekend I spent experimenting with recipes was actually time spent developing our expansion strategy. A student raised her hand. Ms. Sullivan, how did you manage to keep such massive corporate acquisitions secret while operating from a small bakery? I smiled, remembering all the times Marcus had mocked my cute little office in the bakery's back room. The beauty of being underestimated is that nobody looks too closely at what you're doing. While my husband was bragging about his corporate dealings at expensive restaurants, I was closing multi-million-dollar deals over coffee and scones. Rebecca, who had joined me for the presentation, stepped forward. The bakery strategy was brilliant, she added. Who would suspect that major corporate negotiations were happening in a cozy cafe? It became our competitive advantage. While other companies fought for attention in boardrooms, we were building relationships and trust in a more comfortable environment. Another hand shot up. Is it true that your ex-husband now works for the company? I caught Marcus's eye across the room. He nodded slightly, giving me permission to share his story. Marcus now heads our corporate humility training program, I revealed, causing surprised murmurs through the audience. Who better to teach about the dangers of underestimating others than someone who learned that lesson firsthand? Marcus stood up, surprising everyone by walking to the front of the room. We hadn't planned this, but sometimes the best moments are unscripted. I spent years, he began, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium, telling everyone that my wife was just a baker. I laughed at her business cards, mocked her meetings, and dismissed her suggestions. Meanwhile, she was building one of the most innovative corporate structures I've ever seen. The students were frantically taking notes as Marcus continued. I was so convinced I knew what success looked like that I missed it happening right in front of me. While I was trying to impress people with my corporate title, Amy was quietly acquiring companies that would eventually include my own, the SAT. Lesson, I added, isn't about revenge or power plays. It's about recognizing that success doesn't always wear a designer suit or demand attention. Sometimes it wears an apron and serves fresh-baked ideas that change the business world. A professor raised his hand. Your strategy of using the bakery as a corporate meeting space has revolutionized how we think about business environments. Was that always part of the plan? Actually, I shared, it evolved naturally. I noticed that when people met in my bakery, instead of a sterile conference room, they were more relaxed, more creative, more willing to explore possibilities. While other executives were fighting for the fanciest restaurants, I was building genuine connections over fresh pastries and coffee. Rebecca stepped forward again. The just a baker stereotype became our secret weapon. Nobody suspected that the woman in the apron calculating ingredient costs was actually calculating corporate acquisitions. As the lecture continued, I could see the students' perspectives shifting. They were learning that true business acumen isn't about fitting someone else's mold. It's about finding your unique advantage and having the courage to build something authentic. Last week, I concluded, Sweet Success Holdings announced its international expansion. The small bakery that my ex-husband once called a cute hobby now employs over 10,000 people across 3 continents. And yes, we still serve the best cupcakes in town. The applause was thunderous, but the most meaningful response came from Marcus, who had tears in his eyes as he rejoined me at the podium. I used to think I needed to teach Amy about business, he admitted to the crowd. Turns out, she's teaching all of us about what business can be. As we left the auditorium, a young woman stopped me. Ms. Sullivan, your story gives me hope. My family thinks my small flower shop is just a hobby. I smiled, remembering my own journey. There's no such thing as just anything, I told her. Every empire starts somewhere. Mine started with cupcakes. Where will yours begin? 18 months after the acquisition that changed everything, I stood in my original bakery kitchen, preparing for a very special event. The warm aroma of vanilla and success filled the air as I put the finishing touches on a cake that represented everything my journey had become. Is everything ready? Rebecca asked, entering through the back door that had once been my secret passage to corporate meetings. She was carrying the latest copy of Fortune magazine, the one with my face on the cover, titled, From Cupcakes to Corporate, How One Woman's Little Bakery Changed Modern Business. Almost, I replied, adding the final golden details to the cake. How's the setup going next door? Next door was now Sweet Success Institute, a business incubator I'd created specifically for underestimated entrepreneurs. The space that Marcus had once dismissed as a waste of good retail frontage now housed dozens of small business owners building their own empires. The graduates are getting nervous, Rebecca smiled. It's not every day they present their business. Plans to the CEO who turned a bakery into a billion-dollar corporation. Today marked the first graduation ceremony of our Hidden Giants program, an intensive business development course designed specifically for entrepreneurs who'd been told their dreams were too small or just hobbies. Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking different than he had during his corporate consulting days. The designer suits were gone, replaced by casual business wear and an authentic smile. His role as head of our humility training program had transformed him as much as it had our corporate culture. The press is here, he announced. They're particularly interested in interviewing the flower shop owner who's now running a nationwide sustainable agriculture program. I smiled, remembering the young woman who'd approached me after my Harvard lecture. She'd taken our program's lessons about hidden potential and quiet growth to heart, turning her cute little flower shop into a revolutionary force in sustainable farming. You know what's funny? Marcus said, helping me box up the celebration cake. I remember standing in this exact spot, telling you that real business happens in boardrooms, not bakeries. Now Fortune 500 CEOs wait months for a chance to have a strategy session here. The bakery's private tasting room, once my covert corporate command center, had become the most exclusive meeting space in the business world. There was now a 6-month waiting list for what we called our cookie conferences. High-level business meetings conducted over fresh pastries and coffee. The best part, Rebecca added, is that half of them don't even realize they're meeting. In the same room where we planned the regional foods acquisition, I carried the finished cake through to the Institute's main hall, where 50 graduates waited to present their business plans. Each of them had a story similar to mine. Small business owners with big dreams, entrepreneurs whose ideas had been dismissed or underestimated. Before we begin, I addressed the crowd, I want to share something with you. This cake isn't just for celebration, it's a reminder. The sugar flowers represent growth, the golden details represent value, and the seemingly simple structure holds layers of complexity, just like each of your businesses. Marcus stepped forward, no longer the condescending husband, but a humbled ally in our mission to change business culture. When Amy first told me about this institute, I thought she was being too optimistic. I said, "Not everyone can turn a bakery into a corporate empire." But looking at all of you today, I realize I'm still learning not to underestimate people. One by one, the graduates presented their plans. There was a dog walker who'd developed an AI-powered pet care network, a house cleaner who'd created an eco-friendly cleaning products corporation, and a gardener who'd invented a revolutionary urban farming system. You see, I concluded as the presentations ended, there's no such thing as just a baker or just a dog walker or just anything. Every business, every dream has the potential to change the world. Sometimes the biggest ideas come in the smallest packages, or in my case, in a cupcake wrapper. As we celebrated with cake and coffee, I caught sight of my original Chief Executive Baker business card, now framed on the Institute's wall of inspiration. Below it was the quote that had become our motto: "Success doesn't shout, it rises, quietly, like the perfect soufflé." Marcus joined me in admiring the wall. "I spent so many years looking down on your little bakery," he mused. "I never realized I was standing in the middle of a revolution." "That's the beauty of underestimation," I replied, watching our graduates celebrate their achievements. "It gives you the freedom to build something extraordinary while everyone else is looking the other way." The Sweet Success Institute had become more than just a business incubator. It was a testament to the power of quiet ambition and patient growth. Every graduate represented another small business ready to rise beyond expectations, another entrepreneur ready to turn just a hobby into something remarkable. And as I cut the celebration cake, surrounded by the next generation of business innovators, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the sweetest success isn't in proving others wrong. It's in proving yourself right, one small victory at a time. 2 years after the acquisition that transformed the business world's understanding of small business, I sat for an intimate interview in my original bakery. Time magazine had chosen me as their Person of the Year, not just for my corporate success, but for the movement it had inspired. "Looking back," the interviewer asked, adjusting her recorder on the same table where Marcus had once explained real business to me, "did you ever imagine your bakery would spark a global revolution in business thinking?" The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the golden lettering on our wall. "Every empire rises one dream at a time." The bakery still opened at 6 a.m. every day, still served the same recipes that had started it all. But now it was also a pilgrimage site for entrepreneurs worldwide. "You know what's remarkable?" I responded, watching our latest batch of Business Incubator participants gather for their morning strategy session. The bakery was never just a bakery. It was proof that success doesn't need to follow someone else's recipe. The Sweet Success Institute had now expanded to 30 locations worldwide, each one attached to a working bakery. We'd graduated over 1,000 entrepreneurs from our program, with a combined business valuation exceeding $10 billion. Every success story had started with someone being told their dream was too small or just a hobby. Marcus entered, carrying a fresh tray of croissants. His transformation from condescending executive to passionate mentor had become its own case study in personal growth. "These are for the tech startup group," he explained. "They're presenting their AI platform to investors today." "The same table where you used to mock my business plans?" I couldn't resist teasing. He smiled ruefully. "The same table where I proved that the biggest business mistake is underestimating someone's potential." The interviewer leaned forward. "Your story has inspired thousands, but it's also changed how major corporations approach innovation. Can you talk about the bakery boardroom phenomenon?" I laughed, remembering how revolutionary it had seemed when we first started hosting corporate meetings in our tasting room. Now, Companies worldwide were creating informal, comfortable spaces for business negotiations. The stuffy boardroom was becoming as outdated as the notion that size determined success. Sweet success. Holdings now owns 60% of the corporate consulting market, the interviewer noted. But you still work from this bakery every morning. Why? Because this is where real business happens, I explained, gesturing to the diverse group of entrepreneurs working at various tables. In comfortable spaces where people feel free to dream big. Every morning, I bake alongside our incubator participants. We talk strategy over coffee, plan expansions while frosting cupcakes, and prove that you can build an empire without losing touch with where you started. Rebecca arrived, impeccably dressed as always, but now wearing one of our signature aprons over her designer suit. Board meeting in 10 minutes, she announced. We're finalizing the expansion into Asia. In the bakery? The interviewer asked. Always in the bakery, Rebecca confirmed. There's something about the aroma of fresh bread that makes even the toughest negotiations more productive. The bell above the door chimed as David Palmer entered, now our head of international operations. The Tokyo team is on video conference, he announced. They love the idea of combining traditional Japanese pastries with corporate training spaces. I stood, smoothing my apron. Would you like to observe a real board meeting? I asked the interviewer. See how the Just a Baker runs a global corporation? As we moved to the private tasting room, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I was wearing the same type of apron I'd worn when Marcus first dismissed my business ambitions, but now it was accessorized with the quiet confidence of someone who had transformed an industry. One last question, the interviewer said as we walked. What's next for the woman who turned a bakery into a business revolution? I smiled, thinking of the hundreds of underestimated entrepreneurs currently working through our program. We're not just building businesses, I replied. We're baking up a whole new definition of success. One where just a baker, or just a florist, or just anything becomes just watch me change the world. The sweet aroma of success filled the air as we entered the boardroom, still equipped with its original baking racks alongside the state-of-the-art conference technology. Here, where Marcus had once laughed at my business cards, global strategies were now shaped, and futures were baked into reality. Sometimes the biggest dreams rise from the smallest beginnings, and sometimes being underestimated is the secret ingredient in the recipe for success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.